If I were to ask you to name a president who was born in a log cabin, I'm guessing that you would have the same answer as me and thousands of other Americans: Abraham Lincoln. Well, right now I am traveling through the state of Kentucky, and we are near the town of Hodgenville, and I decided to take a quick stop at the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, where this memorial sits right behind me, stood the cabin that served as the birthplace of our 16th president. Like I mentioned, we are near the town of Hodgenville, Kentucky. And in the fall of 1808, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln purchased a property right here that was known as the Sinking Springs Farm. And a cabin was built right up here where this memorial currently stands. And on February 12th of 1809, just a few months after having moved to this location, well, Nancy gave birth to their second child and their first son, a little boy that they would name Abraham, who would, of course, go on to become our 16th president. I just mentioned that this farm was known as the Sinking Spring Farm, and there is a reason for that. If you come to Kentucky, this has a lot of what is called karst topography, so there's a lot of limestone, a lot of caves. And if you look right down here, well, in the background, you might be able to hear running water. Well, there is a natural spring that is flowing right down here, kind of in this sinkhole. And this is probably one of the reasons why Thomas Lincoln chose to settle here on this 300-acre property. Here is a photo of the sinking spring that was taken in later years. So it's quite probable that Abraham Lincoln had his first drink of water that was drawn from this spring right here. So again, being a dependable source of water is probably why the Lincolns chose to build their home right here on top of this hill, so they could easily come down and draw water for cooking and for drinking. All right, now we are going to come back out in just a moment and go up to the memorial site because there's something inside that I'm really wanting to see. But also here on this site, they have a visitor center that talks about the early life of Abraham Lincoln and about Abraham Lincoln's family. So we're going to dodge inside real quick and see what we can learn about the early life of our 16th president. All right, we just walked into the visitor center here, and as you walk in, one of the first things that greets you is the Lincoln family. So here we are looking at a likeness of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln and their daughter Sarah, and a young Abraham Lincoln who was born on Sunday, February 12th of 1809. And then over here, they're going to have a few artifacts here in the exhibit. And this one that we are looking at right here, you can see has the initials TL engraved on it. That is for Thomas Lincoln. This was a field stone that marked the grave of Abraham Lincoln's younger brother, who was born in 1812, but only lived a few days. Of course, during this period of time, infant mortality was especially high. But yeah, this was the grave marker for Thomas Lincoln. Here's another artifact that is exceptionally interesting to me personally. This is the family Bible for the Lincolns. Lincoln once said that, he says, in regard to this great book, I have but to say it is the best gift God has given to man. And in the frontier world, well, in a lot of frontier families, the Bible was the only book that they may have possessed. So a grown-up Lincoln would have recorded his own birth and important dates in the family pages of the Bible, but those pages are being kept by the Chicago Historical Society. But yeah, that is really, really interesting. So here on this display, they talk about the movement of the Lincoln family. So in the late 1700s, well, Lincoln's grandfather, whose name was also Abraham Lincoln, so Abraham Lincoln was named after his grandfather, moved through the Cumberland Gap. His grandfather was actually killed by Native Americans, and then his father, Thomas Lincoln, ended up settling here in this area of Kentucky. So they lived here at the Sinking Springs farm for a few years and then were forced to move. And then also here, they talk about the family lineage of Abraham Lincoln. And okay, so here we have Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd. But something that I found interesting is if you go back in his family history, well, you see the name right here, Bridget Gilman. Well, she was the daughter of Edward Gilman. This is the fifth great-grandmother of Abraham Lincoln. But through her line, well, you have also John Hancock, Nicholas Gilman, who was a signer of the Constitution, Nathan Gorman, who's a signer of the Constitution, Salmon Chase, who was going to be his Secretary of Treasury, and then other descendants in that line are the Wright brothers, Tennessee Williams, Gerald Ford, Robert Frost, and then both of the Bushes who served as president. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting. Oh, also, something that I found interesting in this family history that they have here is Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln, had a brother, older brother named Mordecai. Well, Mordecai Lincoln married a woman named Mary Mudd, who was the first cousin twice removed to Dr. Samuel Mudd, who was one of the conspirators in the Lincoln assassination. Here we are looking at some photographs of Lincoln's parents. So on the left is Thomas Lincoln. He was a carpenter and a cabinet maker, but had aspirations of being a farmer. And on the right is Abraham Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. So she and Thomas were married in June of 1806. In 1807, gave birth to a baby girl named Sarah, and then Abraham is going to be the second son of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. And tragically, Nancy Lincoln is going to die when Abraham is only 9 years old. And it says here that he once told a friend, "Everything I am or ever hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." So Lincoln's life is going to be beset with tragedy from a very early age. I know this is kind of cool. I mentioned that Thomas Lincoln was a carpenter and cabinet maker. What we are looking at here is a walnut table that was made by Thomas Lincoln. Yeah, that's interesting. So again, here in the visitor center, they're talking about the early life of Abraham Lincoln. And again, he's born in a log cabin. So here they have some different tools that some of the early frontiersmen would have used in order to build a log cabin. So I mean, this was a hard life that these people were living. And then if you go around, they have like this little log cabin representation that you can walk into to get just a general idea of what it would have been like. Now, the Sinking Springs farm is only going to be home to the Lincolns for a couple of years. Lincoln paid, his father rather, Thomas Lincoln paid $200 cash for the Sinking Spring farm. It was 300 acres, which is kind of crazy to think about today. But there ended up being some problems with the land title, and they were forced to move to the nearby Knob Creek farm. Now, this is kind of interesting. What we were looking at is a cross-section of what was called the boundary oak tree here on the Sinking Springs farm. So when the Lincolns moved here in 1808, well, this white oak tree marked one corner of the property. It was about 150 yards from the family cabin. It was probably estimated to be 25 to 30 years old at the time that Abraham Lincoln, when he was born here. And then, of course, over time, grew and died. And in 1976, well, it was cut down, and then this cross section was saved as kind of a link to our 16th president. All right, we've moved back outside, and in 1909, it was decided that something special needed to be done here for the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. So in February of that year, another great president, Teddy Roosevelt, came to this spot and laid the cornerstone for a memorial that would sit over where the log cabin where Abraham Lincoln had once resided and where he had been born. And then it would later be finished under the Taft administration. So we're going to go up and take a look at this memorial site. When you come to this memorial site, well, there's a lot of symbolism that was embedded in this memorial. Right now, as we are ascending these steps, if you were to count them, you would count 56 steps. This is to be symbolic of the 56 years that Abraham Lincoln lived before he was assassinated in April of 1865. And then right here, etched in stone, it says, "Here over the log cabin where Abraham Lincoln was born, destined to preserve the Union and to free the slaves, a grateful people have dedicated this memorial to unity, peace, and brotherhood among the states." Here, before you go into the memorial, they have a couple of information panels that tell you a little bit about this site. And then here we see a photo of the dedication on February 12th of 1909, where they laid the cornerstone for the memorial. And then again, as I mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt is going to be here for the laying of that cornerstone. Teddy Roosevelt is one of my favorite presidents. Well, not one of my favorite presidents, he is my favorite president. But he wasn't a perfect man. He was a rather complex figure. And I think when we look at Lincoln, there's been kind of a mythology that has been built around Abraham Lincoln. I do consider him to be one of the greatest presidents, but he also made mistakes. There were some imperfections in his life and in his presidency. But I think if you take his deeds and weigh them out, well, I think he comes out as a net positive for the history of this country and his role in preserving the Union. All right, let's go inside and take a look at what there is to see inside of the memorial. Well, here inside this ornate, ostentatious granite memorial is a humble log cabin that represents the log cabin that Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, was born in. A little bit more about the background on this memorial. There was a group that was formed in the run-up to the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth called the Lincoln Farm Association. Members included Mark Twain, Ida B. Tarbell, Samuel Gompers, okay, some rather well-known names. And there was a public grassroots effort that was kicked off to raise money to build this memorial. There was 110 acres of the original Sinking Springs farm that was purchased, and then they started construction on the memorial site, again starting with the laying of the cornerstone in February of 1909 with Teddy Roosevelt in attendance. It was completed a few years later under the Taft administration, and again there's symbolism out here, or inside of the memorial as well. There are 16 windows representing the fact that Lincoln was our 16th president. And then if you look, you have these representations of fence posts around the cabin. There are 16 of those, again, representing the fact that Lincoln was our 16th president. And this is now part of the national park system. I think the national parks and the national historic sites that we have in the United States was one of our best ideas. And in a time when I think people of all political persuasions can agree that there's a lot of government waste on stupid stuff, well, I think that investing in land and in historic sites and in the preservation of our history is a worthwhile and wise use of our financial resources. And yeah, the continued preservation of this site is part of that. Yeah, this is really neat. Now, Lincoln would only spend a short amount of time here at the Sinking Spring Farm, likely had no memory of this place whatsoever. There was a land title dispute, and Thomas Lincoln ended up having to move his family to the nearby Knob Creek Farm, where Lincoln spent some of his early childhood years. Fortunately, we can't visit there today because we are running out of time. But anyway, you might be asking yourself, why is the birthplace of a president such an important thing? Why would we memorialize it? Well, I think that this is a good reminder of how important it is to invest in the next generation. Lincoln's parents and his family had no idea what Lincoln's future had in store for him, and that he would be playing a huge role in preserving the Union. But they poured into him, and they loved him, they educated him, and provided him with a solid foundation that he would build the rest of his life on. But anyway, that was a little bit from right here in Kentucky at the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln.